testosterone, we have a problem.
This is Outside the Manosphere, where two guys with zero credentials dive past the cliches of masculinity and try to become better friends by actually talking to each other. It's weirdly hard, but we're doing it anyway. Join us. Welcome to Outside the Manosphere. My name is Carlos.
And I'm Skip.
How do you do, Skip?
I'm doing great. I'm a little tired from a day of physiotherapy and then actual exercise. But other than that, I'm in a great mood. I'm really excited to talk to Pete, since I'm now pretending that we haven't done it yet.
Pretending we didn't just finish it and now we're bookending the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we just spoke with Dr. Pete Fisher from
Movember Institute of Men's Health, where he is a research fellow.
Yes, I knew all that. It's just one of those mahjong things that I just can't keep in my brain.
Oh, no, I have it written down because I keep transposing the words because it makes sense in almost any order.
Right. And we were discussing the Real Face of Men's Health report that he was co-author of. Yeah, so we had a pretty extensive conversation.
Probably be broken up into multiple parts. And it's a while before we even get to the report.
Well, it was all relevant.
Yeah.
But
No, it definitely is. Yeah.
Yeah. So very grateful for him to have joined us for as long as he did. And this will probably be in two parts because it is a lot of information, but very, very useful and interesting. And with that, I think we should just launch right into it. What do you think, Skip?
Sounds good. Hello, and we are here with Dr. Peter Fisher from the Movember Institute of Men's Health, and we're here to talk about the Real Face of Men's Health report and maybe a little bit about masculinity. How are you doing today, Pete?
I'm doing great, Skip. Thanks again for having me back. Always good to talk with you both.
Let's start with an overly complex question that sounds simple. What is masculinity? Because I know this is something that you're working on.
Yeah, there's no simple answer, which is the interesting part. And the idea of masculinity is it's an identity that is providing purpose and direction. And it's also kind of a set of ideas that are co-constructed by people within a given culture or society. If that sounds broad, it is, because the idea is that researchers have kind of shifted in the last 10 or 15 years to kind of using the term masculinities to describe that there are multiple ways of expressing this concept of masculinity. And so it's not just one kind of specific set of principles or ideas. I think what a lot of us think of when we think of masculinity is maybe this idea of traditional masculinity or traditional masculine ideology, which is in the West kind of this set of principles grounded in, men are providers, independent and strong, never show weakness, don't show emotions and things. And that's kind of delving into the realm of stereotype a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it also closely aligns with cultural expectations, peer pressure, media representation a lot of the time of strong male figures. And so there's definitely a mixed kind of sense of what is masculine out there. There are also alternative visions of masculinity that are more kind of nuanced and complex, where, I think we've seen a lot of in recent years, for example, like pro sports players coming out or starting foundations around mental health, suicide prevention, things like that. So, these are kind of the prototypical masculine guys who are also embracing kind of these non-traditional masculine forms of like emotional conversations and supporting men in ways that are more grounded in relationships rather than competition. Yeah, masculinity is a broad spectrum of things. There's many different ways to express it. And at Movember, what we kind of focus on is supporting healthy, adaptive versions of masculinity or ways of being a man. One of the interesting things we found in our research is that the term masculinity has become very polarized recently, to the point where if you ask people two questions that are essentially getting at the same thing, where it's like, what would you be interested in having a conversation around masculinity today versus would you have a conversation about what it means to be a man today? People strongly prefer the second and are much less inclined to have a conversation if you ask specifically about masculinity. And I think it's kind of gotten swept up and associated with the term toxic masculinity. And that can be threatening for men. It can be kind of exhausting for anyone because there's a lot of punditry and kind of mainstream conversations around it. And so it can ultimately be not best way to engage people on the term, which is kind of ironic. But what people do understand is leading with issues. So the idea that men are facing issues like loneliness, like needing friends, and like feeling a sense of purpose and things. And so when you lead with that, that can be a more productive route to kind of engaging on topics related to masculinity.
So like what it sounds like you're talking to us about is like the traditional norms of masculinity and how maybe that's shifting, and there's lots of different forms, and that's really curious. But in the report, one of the things that you were talking about is I think men still kind of see that traditional masculinity, and they think that that's what the norm is, but sometimes inaccurately.
Yes. And we're actually starting up an entire line of research around this idea that there's this misperception among men between kind of individual men and their beliefs and ideas around what is kind of like the right way to be a guy and like navigate the world as a man versus kind of what they are perceiving as societal norms or expectations. And there's often a big misperception there. And so when I say that, what I mean is that, for example, a man individually might say like, oh, I really want to have deeper emotional conversations with my friends who are guys. But the reason I don't do that is because I think that most of them think that that's not what they want. But then if you go pull each of the guys in like that friend group individually, they're all saying they want to be doing that. And there's this misperception, right? Where all of a sudden at the group level, there's this weird misunderstanding of what the norm is, even though there's this individual desire for this kind of healthier behavior, right? Or this way of like engaging. And the way that happens is that there's this societal level kind of pressure that men are navigating where it can be threatening to go counter to that. And so that kind of pushes down any deviation from those traditional masculine kind of norms, unless there's kind of certain structures in place, right? And that can look like, a men's group, for example, for helping men kind of open up these conversations. But men don't have a lot of moments in their lives where they can get through that misperception, where they can be like, oh, I didn't realize I wasn't the only one thinking that way. And so that's kind of where our research, we want to do a better job of kind of documenting this misperception as a phenomenon, specifically as it relates to men's health, right? Because there's this idea that guys that just have to appear strong, and both like this like manifests, and we talk about this in the report, is like going to the doctor later, even though they're experiencing symptoms, like not talking about mental health until it becomes, impacting their daily life. And so, moving the needle on that, better documenting that, and then creating intervention approaches to help men kind of reduce that perception gap and understand that a lot of people have very different beliefs. And it's not just this one kind of very narrow understanding of masculinity. And again, this is tying back to the kind of social norms element, right? Where it's like the norms that are in place are kind of constrictive on purpose, where it's like pushing men into one way of being. And one of the intervention approaches we're kind of toying around with and developing is, what does it look like to show men that there are multiple ways of being a man, and how could this lead to, just from that understanding of like, oh, I don't have to be just like this, I can do it this way, or pick and choose kind of what I think is good to do. And then how does that come about when those people are now interacting with other people? Does that help kind of break down that misperception? And so, that's what we're calling it, the perception gap.
Yeah, what it actually reminds me of is like when I was in high school and I would have a crush on a girl and the girl would have a crush on me. And, you're just both too nervous to say anything about it because there's a fear there of being rejected or having it be awkward or whatever. And so not that these guys want to date each other or anything, but like that guys are around each other and they do want that next level of like just talking a little bit more and getting a little deeper and having that intimacy, but they're afraid that they might be rejected. And in some cases, I think, and maybe we've talked about this before about these men spaces, or maybe I've heard it elsewhere. Sometimes men will like kind of performatively reject it, even if they want it, because they think that's the role that they're playing. And they're also afraid of being judged for like acquiescing to that desire or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was saying. Like the norms are set up kind of in society, these traditional masculine norms in ways that are kind of oppressive for men's health, and men's mental health in particular, where the norm of judging people for wanting to have these deeper emotional connections with other men can really backfire and lead to isolation, loneliness, feelings of like you're not able to express yourself even though you have a desire to. And men really get caught in that loop of like wanting to open up, but then when presented with that situation, they are worried about appearing weak or being misperceived as gay. And then there's a whole negative stigma there. And a lot of men have difficulty navigating that. And so a lot of straight men. And so, yeah, there's just it's a delicate thing to kind of help men navigate those pressures and find a way to get to those conversations in ways that are more like feel less of like a big leap. I think when we see those conversations happening is after major life events. So somebody gets divorced, somebody has a big diagnosis, somebody goes through, there's like a traumatic event, and then you can have those conversations. But the idea is that it shouldn't take something major in your life to recognize the need for the value of having those conversations. It can kind of be done as like preventative work rather than reactive to a major situation or something. And so that's kind of one of the avenues that we're interested in at Movember, is kind of like making the perception of the norm such that men feel comfortable having this be, when you call your friend for like a monthly checkup, this can be a part of it, where it's like, hey, like, how are you feeling? Like, I know you just had a kid. Like, have you been sleeping okay? Like, just like these little questions, little check-ins that can kind of lead to these bigger emotional pieces. And that's ultimately what it is it's breaking it down from this thing of like men fearing for all of these missteps that may happen from deviating from a perceived norm or what they perceive is a norm, but may not even be something that the other person they're talking to actually cares about at all.
Right.
And helping men kind of get over that and seeing it as for what it is, which is just like a small step of like building, meaningful connection.
Well, an irony that I'm hearing too is, so kind of a map of my mind here. I was thinking how, when I speak with a woman, not every woman obviously, but when I speak with women, I'm like an open book emotionally. Like I'll just dump all my traumas if it's in conversational context. But with a man, I'll rarely, if never, do that. But the thought of having a men's space, because like the thought of that just for myself it's very unattractive. Like I don't really want to share or overshare with a man. Like it's just not in my character. But the thought of having like a men's space, I'm like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Where there's an expectation that we're all going to be doing that. And the irony to me is that it's a tragic irony that's kind of like a safe space. You know what I mean? It's so poo-pooed by so much of these masculine guys, but that's kind of what that is. And it's a really constructive place to be to discuss your emotions and your feelings and your traumas and all the things that are weighing you down.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that because it's like you're code switching.
Yeah,
you're code switching between genders, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really great point, Carlos, the like irony of, and also like a lot of these masculine influencers are kind of creating safe spaces for men to engage in topics of masculinity, and that they're not going to brand it like that, but that's really what they're trying to do, is to create a space where men can like learn about masculinity, because that's how a lot of the on-ramps into that Manosphere content is around those basic questions around, how do I talk to girls? How do I, make friends? How do I get strong? How do I be successful? And then it leads them into these kind of echo chambers. But again, those are vulnerable questions, right? No doubt about it. And the fact that these masculine influencers have kind of capitalized on that is interesting. But I think, creating more spaces, analog physical spaces where men and boys can kind of engage in those topics can only be a good thing. And then the other piece I want to say is that, yes, I think it's well documented that, women and girls are kind of socialized into having emotional conversations from a much younger age, and they have that kind of like toolkit available to them. And that's like a regular part of, like friendships and relationships for a lot of women, and men just don't have that socialization piece. In fact, it's the opposite, where men are kind of told to be self-reliant and not show those things. And so men kind of have to a lot of times unlearn that to obtain the ability, because that's what it is. It's like, it takes practice, it takes skills, it takes getting it wrong, oversharing, undersharing, to find the right kind of balance and nuance of these conversations. It's not easy. Definitely don't want to downplay that of just like, oh, just have that emotional conversation around a topic that has been taboo for you to talk about most of your life, or at least you felt that pressure. But what ends up, because of that kind of different dynamic between men and women, is that women take on a lot of emotional processing for men, especially in straight relationships where, the female partner will be doing their emotional regulation and then also their partners, where it's like their partner's kind of offloading that, because some men have, and that's a documented process called man
keeping.
I think we might have discussed earlier. Yeah, Angelica Ferrara's work on that is fantastic, and I think that's also pretty well known. The idea of like emotional labor, and that's putting the empirical lens to it, and I think that's so important. But I think for me, what that is like motivating for me, both as a researcher and as a guy, is like, oh, I don't want to be creating more work for other people. It's like, how do I help myself like be better at, taking this on and like building up my social connections and social abilities around having emotional conversations. And it's something I'm still, engaging in, like trial and error. I think especially with the pandemic, it opened up a lot of avenues for like digital conversations on like Discord and voice calls and like both like individual and like group chats. And it's been cool because I think, in the past, I played video games on Discord a fair bit. In the past, it's always been instrumental, where it's like those are spaces where it's like we're doing an activity and we're just communicating. And now it's like the activity is kind of secondary. And I'm using that as an opportunity to check in on friends who I'm not like seeing every day or very frequently, and having these kind of like bigger conversations. And it's been really rewarding. I think I've been enjoying it a lot, where it's like we can have the game, but it's also like a fun check-in, and we can go a little deeper than we have in the past. And I think that's really what I found has worked for me, is like finding something where it was something that I was already doing, and just building in another layer of like, okay, like this is a space where we're already communicating, we're already doing something we both enjoy. Let me just like add a couple things where we can like get some more substantive content out about, like in terms of like, checking in on each other. And I will say, referring back to man keeping, I think the motivation behind that was my fiance. After having some of these sessions where I'd be playing games with friends, she'd be like, oh, like what's new with Steve? And I would be like, oh, he's good at this game, and that would be my update. And now being able to like, oh yeah, I should like check in about life stuff beyond just the fun game stuff. So that's been my personal experience with that.
Are these friends of yours like in the real world, or are they just online friends?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of so I have both. I would say mostly in-person friends who have kind of moved away, or like college friends who I like stay in touch with. That way, friends who have kids and we have a very short window where we're both online. Right. And so, but yeah, and then there's a couple friends as well, where it's like been friends of friends who I met through Discord, mostly during the pandemic, and then we become friends in real life as well.
It's funny, like listening to you talk as a parent with kids, one of the things that when they're very young, like they're learning to play with each other and like physically, and with like, they're learning boundaries, and they're learning how to work together. And it's like men never got the emotional half of that. So like when you're talking about learning to, sometimes you're oversharing, sometimes you're undersharing. It's just like that same process, but now we're having to go through it as an adult because we never did it when we were a kid, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it, Skip. And I think it's harder as an adult because you don't want to be seen as learning these kind of fundamental, at least as a guy, there's also this perception of like fallibility, where it's like, it can be hard to be open about, like this is something I'm working on, and being open about that. And there's a vulnerability aspect to it that, as a kid, you don't even think about. It's just like you're learning it for the first time. So, but as an adult, it's kind of like picking up a new hobby, going to the tennis court and like seeing all the people who are really good at it, and then being like, I'm going to just do my thing over here. But I mean, that's what it takes. You got to get your reps in.
And to admit ignorance too, like that is a currency that goes so far socially. When you don't go in there like top dog and you don't know what you're talking about, when you admit, I don't know, like nobody expects you to have the answers to everything just because you're a man, you know what I mean? And I found, I don't know, I feel respect from people, specifically women, when I'm like, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know. What do you think? You know what I mean? It's it's just being human, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting because it does run counter to some of the narratives we see in the manosphere of like confidence and almost this like intellectual superiority, even though it's not. It's basically just never. It's an extension of this idea of never showing weakness, is like never showing lack of knowledge or something. But ultimately, it leads to this place of like extreme brittleness, where any topic where you're not an expert on, you like kind of have to shut down or like move away from. And it's like that's not a great way to move through life. And it's interesting, when I was in grad school, I had some great advice from an advisor at a lab meeting where it was like, a lot of you may feel the pressure to just chime in to like show what you know, but think about actually waiting and asking about what you don't know, because that is going to be how you learn in this space more efficiently. And I love that because it was like, talk about an example of norm setting for like a group space, but it was like immediately moving away from this idea of like performative, like competitiveness, like, oh, I need to show my status, to like, no, we're all here to learn. And this is how you do it, is by asking questions and acknowledging what you don't know. But yeah, that sounds simple, but it can be really hard. I think there's a lot of like, I see it in my dad's generation of like guys who, it's almost like dad logic, where it's like they have to be the encyclopedia of all things. Right. They don't know it. They're like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's not right. But then they like don't go deeper into it. So it's like this kind of idea of this very traditionally masculine idea of like being infallible, I think can lead to, just ultimately just like moving people away from engaging in new things and shutting them down, which again, going back to my original point, is like, that's kind of what the repressiveness of those traditional masculine norms looks like.
Well, I'm interested in multiple masculinities. That's a concept that I had never heard of before. It reminds me of multiple intelligences, which is fairly new, I think, on the scene of psychology. But can you tell us a little bit more about what that means, or even different types of multiple masculinities?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is like a social psychologist. So I'm looking at, the person in the situation and all the contextual forces aside from the internal forces that are kind of dictating our behavior. And this notion of multiple masculinity is kind of born out of some of the work done in cultural psychology, which is essentially acknowledging that, our cultures are shaping our beliefs and behaviors as much as our internal psychology is. And the notion of multiple masculinities is basically that, there's no one set of masculine ideals. There's entire constellations of like traits and characteristics that align with masculinity most of the time, but in other situations, they don't. And multiple masculinities is this attempt kind of theoretically to move away from this like the psionic bastion of like traditional masculinity, which is like very narrow. Multiple masculinities is like very broad, and addressing that there can be like pieces of like femininity and traditional masculinity and like more nuanced adaptive masculinity or healthy masculinities in there, and people can kind of be flexible around it. There's another idea of multiple masculinities, is this notion of rigidity versus flexibility in norm adherence when it comes to masculine. So what I mean when I say that is that these traditional masculine norms, a lot of them in isolation aren't bad, right? Where it's like being self-reliant can be really adaptive in a lot of situations where you can, take care of yourself and be independent. It's when that's rigidly adhered to in every situation, it can become harmful, right? Where it's like, no, you can't accept help, right? You're not a good team player. You're not a collaborator because you have this overly like ingrained desire to be self-reliant. And so there's a notion of like building in flexibility so that you can kind of dial it down when it's appropriate, which is essentially like gauging it to the situation and not adhering to this like strict code where it's like, oh, I always have to be these things, right? Where it's like recognizing the situation may call for a different approach and embracing that. And so that's a nuanced idea, right? And it's kind of moving away from like the code of masculinity, right? Where it's like, and also how they talk about it in the Manosphere, where it's like, just do these 3 things and you'll be a successful guy, right? Where it's like, the truth is a little more complicated. There's a lot more gray, right? Where it could be important to be stoic in certain situations where it's like, there's something you need to, get through. And then other moments where it's like, no, you need to express those emotions and share them openly for you to have the kind of best outcome health-wise or social, wise. And so that's like a pretty foundational piece. And I think that helps you understand. But the idea of multiple masculinities is like, your masculinity may look different than mine. And it's like this shared understanding that it's like we're both guys navigating these different pressures, and we have different expressions at different times. And so there's a contextual factor as well of just recognizing that masculinity isn't this kind of abstract identity that's informing everything downstream, that there's also, situational forces that are, encouraging things. For example, we already talked about where it's like in a room of guys where there's certain scaffolds in place, you can have emotional conversation. And then there's other rooms where it's like, at a sports bar might not happen the same way, right? And those are situational forces that are dictating kind of how my gender identity is being expressed in that moment. And so that's kind of the foundation of this idea of multiple masculinities, is just that even within an individual, across situations, there can be multiple expressions of what we're calling masculinity.
How new of a concept is that?
I would say, the entire field of the psychology of men and masculinity is only around 40 years old. I would say that idea is around maybe 20 years old. I think it first came around early 2090s, and then it's kind of been followed up since then. And there's been different notions of masculinity. It really is interesting because masculinity is such the study of men and masculinities as a field is really interdisciplinary, where, I'm a social psychologist. There's a lot of sociologists, a lot of the foundational work by like Raymond Connell out of Australia has been from a sociological lens. And then there's also anthropologists, there's, social work folks, there's clinical psychologists looking at it more from, how are traditional masculinity impacting health outcomes and things like that. And so it's really diverse. And what that means is that it can be kind of scattered theoretically, where there's people in one field or discipline coming up with a theory that's kind of been out there for 10 years, but they're just putting it into their discipline's language. And recently there's been more kind of cohesion across those and collaboration. So this notion of multiple masculinities has been around for a while, but I think it's taken a couple of years of work. I think one framework, for example, is the positive psychology, positive masculinity framework, where that's kind of operationalizing this idea of multiple masculinities from like a clinical psychology perspective, where they created a framework where it's like acknowledging the importance of bringing strengths to the conversations around men's mental health. Because a lot of it has been deficit based, and even what I've been talking about today, where it's like the traditional masculine norms are oppressive or repressive or constraining. And there's also aspects of masculinity that are motivating and empowering and feeling like, provide really important psychological needs. And so that framework has kind of helped address that. And so it's like, there's language coming from different disciplines and fields and theories and different frameworks that are all kind of building from this foundational idea of multiple masculinities.
Yeah. And I know that you kind of are from that background of positive psychology and stuff like that. So I'm really curious, like, if there's anything specific that you can tell us about that's like a positive rather than a deficit-based kind of masculinity trait or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, it's hard to make like a blanket statement. I think the rigidity versus flexibility piece is really important here. And I think it's like, there's very few traditional masculine norms. Maybe there's a couple where it's like dominance over women. It's hard to have nuance around that, for example. Right. But there are definitely other ones where it's like, the need to be independent, the need to be strong, that when you bring a strengths-based lens, even to these very traditional masculine connotations, where it's like, it does feel good to be strong. Like, what makes you feel strong? Is it helping others? Right. So it can kind of be this interdependent way of looking at things that in the past guys may have had a very narrow view, where it's like, oh, I have to go to the gym to feel strong. Where it's like, no, it's like maybe even having a conversation with somebody and helping them through a tough time can make you feel strong as like somebody who can, provide emotional support. And that's another one, is like being a provider. It's not just financial. It's not just, resources. It can also be connection. It can be other things. So I think there's a way of like kind of opening up that this positive psychological framework of bringing in strengths to the conversation. It really engages men, where it moves from like, what am I doing wrong and how do I avoid that, to what am I doing right and how can I get better at that and how can I like build those things. And that's really just a productive, at a fundamental psychological level, like that's how you want to have these conversations around learning, around growth, is, don't avoid these minds, this minefield, but like, here's some goals and aspirations you can kind of strive for, while acknowledging that there are real kind of structural barriers that can kind of be difficult. And it's not like downplaying the challenges of that, but it's acknowledging them in this more strengths focused way. And so, I think something that like the reframing of like masculine strength to be broader than a lot of guys think about can be really freeing, where it can be this idea of moving away from physical strength to like social strength and emotional strength, and being a rock for somebody, or being a rock for the friend group, and like that feels good, and it's still grounded in this traditional masculine ideology, but in practice what it looks like is guys who are going out of their way to help others, and feeling strong. And that's so it's like essentially you're getting the same fulfillment of that masculine need, but you're doing it in a way that's now more adaptive rather than kind of destructive and limiting. And so that's like kind of one example. And others, it can be more like inverting the norm entirely, where it's like seeing emotional conversations as something that makes you feel weak and something to avoid. Instead, now seeing those as growth opportunities for deeper social connection with friends. And again, yeah, the strengths-based focus is really great. And that's what the positive psychology, positive masculinity framework is, bringing that into a clinical context, where it's now like thinking about mental health and the kind of both the barriers and supports around men's mental health using that lens. And it's just opened up so many interesting conversations from what I've seen. That framework is great. So that's Kaselika and Wright did the original kind of postulating around that in like 2010. And then Matt Englar Carlson has done a ton of interesting case studies looking at, applying that in different clinical contexts and creating frameworks for, school-based interventions around that. So so much cool stuff coming out of that space.
That's really cool. I like the, like what you were saying about like for a layman like us, it's kind of like reframing, right? Looking at things and finding different ways to call something strength or being strong. And like that's such a really profound, like we were talking last week about ruggedness and some other things, and just like kind of how part of our conversation centered around like how framing something in one way versus another makes a huge difference. And so like I think that's something that I want to keep in mind as we continue to do this podcast, is like thinking of ways to frame things positively for people coming in from that kind of narrow norm, and like so it's accessible to them.
Yeah. And what we found in our work at Movember is like just testing around different messages around this, and mostly around that idea of reframing these concepts that a lot of men have been exposed to and are familiar with, but how, they have the same kind of set of reactions because it's associated with those very kind of constraining set of ideas and I've referred to this earlier, but like leading with the issues is really interesting. And when you bring that strengths-based approach, it leads to more opening up rather than shutting down. And so what that can look like is, like, oh, like I find it hard to connect with friends, and be like, oh, like let's get into that, like what it sounds like you have this desire, like what skills do you want to build to like be able to be better at that? What have you tried? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And so those are like kind of jumping off points that have been like really interesting and definitely like fruitful in ways that, talking about like, what does masculinity mean to you? Those conversations just don't get there. And what we found is that recognizing, and I think there's a piece of it where when you start with the issues, you're already acknowledging that men are going through things that they're having a unique experience, right? And that masculinity is playing a role in that. But for a lot of guys, masculinity is not the lens through which they see the world, right? It's just kind of in the background informing it. And they're not being like approaching a situation, be like, as a guy, what am I doing here? Right? It's like, that's not the frame. And so it's like, why would we try to bring that frame as researchers? What they are doing is like, men are like, oh, I have this problem, or I'm having this experience. And so it's like, let's start with that. And so it's really just kind of aligning the language we use in our research, and also like defining the problem space to align with what we're seeing. And so there's like a big component of, we do a lot of focus groups and in-depth interviews with guys and boys and young men to really make sure that what we're talking about when we're developing new programs or research tools is grounded in that lived experience in ways that feel accessible, that feel engaging. Because if we've got it all right in academic land, and then the way we present it to people is not engaging, like we haven't done our. So I think that's what it comes down to for me and the research team at Movember is, and that's actually, I think a big piece of it is that, clinicians and healthcare providers and psychologists have a lot of the right answers. They don't have the right framing to engage with men and boys around these topics. And so I think that's where a lot of the work is happening for us, because that's where a lot of the work needs to happen, period. I think it's like bringing that idea of gender responsiveness into healthcare using that masculinity lens to inform things at a high level, but then in practice, it means that it might be counterintuitive, but you maybe don't even bring up masculine. You just acknowledge certain things that guys are experiencing, and then you bring this kind of gender responsive, informed approach to those conversations. And so it's really kind of like this hand-holding process of, not to say that like men need that, but it's more of like men may not be thinking about things in certain ways. And like same with the folks who are working with men. And so when you bring that lens, it can kind of it can open new doors that have been closed and that people might feel frustrated, both on the like provider and the like individual side, individual men, of not being able to go through that. And so hopefully like the tools and programs, and specifically the new Healthy Masculinities Index we're developing, will help kind of open those doors.
I have a question that, I mean, I got to be careful how I word this because I don't want it to sound negative, but I'm wondering, do you guys, as researchers and publishers of this research, are you concerned at all that like some of this information, which is objectively true, could be co-opted as a sort of like, well, you see, my grievance is proven valid because it's institutional and not just a result of bad choices, it's a result of policies and social norms and neglected inequities. Is it a concern of yours that, I mean, you need to publish this information because it's true and it's useful, but I could also see how it could just be a way for someone to justify their own like shit behavior. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely, Carl. It's definitely especially with our policy and advocacy teams. It's like, how do we get policies that are addressing this in ways that aren't, scapegoating, or like there's certain narratives out there of like men as victims of society or the structures of society. And I will say, we're not as worried about it because the people who are the most effective communicators around masculinity are already doing that. So they're kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to that, where it's like they are validating this idea that men are victims, and you know that's part of their engagement tactics. Unfortunately, it's disservice to men because it's actually removing agency from them by doing that, where it's like kind of putting them like, you have to, like, you're a victim, you have to listen to what I say to restore your status. And I don't think that is true. I think there are certain structures, and you know, we can get really deep into the academic side of things. You know, there's a lot of, you know, critical theory, like feminist scholars who've talked about, you know, the idea of patriarchy and masculinity as being like very closely aligned, and any form of masculinity that reinforces patriarchy is going to like maintain the power dynamic with men at the top, and that's actually a critique of this idea of hybrid masculinities that comes out of sociology. Of there's multiple versions of masculinity, and men will reframe how they present and think about their masculinity in response to societal pressures, but the orienting force behind that reframing is around maintaining status and power. And so that's an interesting lens. That's more of like societal structures rather than necessarily an individual kind of approach. But that makes sense, right? As an individual, we want to have a positive self-concept and we want to maintain our group status. And so it can be difficult to essentially just move your identity status a few rungs down the ladder and maintain a positive self-image and positive like sense of self. So that's a complication. I'll add. But I think, the main point I want to make is that masculine influencers are already doing this. They're already, you know, any narrative that is engaging to men that's like low-hanging fruit, I would say the folks who are in the manosphere have already kind of done that. And they've done it in ways that position themselves as the only ones who can get guys out of that. And so it's kind of like the classic like snake oil, like create a problem and then I'm the only one with a solution scenario. What we are trying to do at Movember is like acknowledge that there are societal factors and societal forces that are difficult for men. I think, you know, a lot of guys in the wake of Me Too were having difficulty navigating that because men were positioned as kind of the enemy. And men feel like they had a voice in that conversation because it was very like this big societal force that was moving kind of like a lot of upheaval at the same time and reckonings around power dynamics and boundary setting. And men were feeling kind of like there wasn't nuance in that conversation. And I think that's important. That's like kind of how societal change happens, is the nuance comes later. But what that left men feeling at a societal level was kind of feeling almost like disenfranchised, like they didn't have a voice. Which again is ironic because, men occupy most of the power in society and high status positions and are afforded privileges that women aren't. But it's that feeling, that sense of feeling aggrieved, or like that you're status that was taken away. Even young men who are feeling like they missed out on status that previous generations of men had. So it's like an evergreen thing, this concept that can kind of be exploited by certain groups. But that's to say, we want to acknowledge that those feelings are real and valid, but the causes of them might be being exploited, right? This idea that there are structural factors that are difficult for men, but it's not to the degree that a lot of these influencers are kind of like claiming, right? Where it's like society's out to get you and it's like a dog-eat-dog world. It's like, well, not really. It's like, a social connection. There's a lot of like fundamental things that can like help men and like within these structures, but also acknowledging that, there's like absolutely like rising cost of living and things are threatening the fundamental notion of like even being able to be a provider. And these things that men are socialized from a young age to expect. And so what does it look like to navigate these conversations in a way that's healthy and adaptive, is something we're actively exploring. And again, that's kind of like cultural change happens. You have to acknowledge these forces. And there's a way where it's like blaming society and then giving men an out, or it's like acknowledging those barriers and these big like societal level issues and posing the question like, what does it look like to navigate this in a way that's like authentic to you, that's healthy, that's helping others. And so that's kind of where Movember is positioning ourselves.
Well, it's almost like acknowledging some of what these manospheric guys are saying is meeting them in the manosphere. You know what I mean? And you're able to meet them where they're at. You're just like, well, yeah, there is some validity to some of this, but let me explain to you where it's coming from, and you can kind of maybe pull them out of that sort of influence.
It's like the core of what they're saying is true in the sense that there is this like kind of angling of men for feeling like alienated, like they don't know what to do. There's ambiguity, there's uncertainty. They don't know what the model is for like being a good man. And then what those influencers in the manosphere are doing is like offering an updated version of the very like tried and true traditional masculinity as a way out of that. And it's like, well, that's just more of the same, actually. And that's not going to be a solution. And so, what we're trying to do, but it turns out it's much harder to like, the idea of like messaging, the solution is not just do these three things. It's actually like build up these like emotional regulation and social connection skills. Less sexy, right? So that's where, again, going back to the reframing and the messaging piece, it's less sexy, but ultimately it's way more fulfilling, right? This idea that you have these needs and there's like these feelings that you're having in response to both like individual level things and societal level things. And the way out of it is not to watch a bunch of YouTube videos and splash cold water on your face anymore. It's actually to like build up these kind of like more difficult, but ultimately more rewarding approaches of like bringing different lenses to social interactions and the way you talk about emotions and the way you view mental health. So work in progress. But I think, all to say that the Manosphere folks are very good at that kind of messaging. And it does acknowledge those societal things, but it does it in a way that is reinforcing kind of the same issues that led to them in the first place.
Well, go ahead, Skip. Sorry, then I was going to dominate again.
No, I was just gonna try and slowly move us towards the actual men's health report, which we've been kind of ignoring. But if you have one more thing, go for it.
What I was going to say was that it reminds me when you were mentioning the alienating sort of sentiment of these young people, or just people, young men are experiencing. It reminds me of, and we've talked about it before, early in our vast archive of podcasts of episodes, was the men coming back from Vietnam and sort of having the same alienation because of the feminist movement and not knowing where they are in society. And it's almost like it seems almost like the Me Too movement kind of spurred this situation. Well, there's arguable other factors, but the Me Too movement was a big one for this one, which is a feminist movement. And then the feminist movement of the late 60s. And I'll bet you if you go back even further for universal suffrage, there was a similar reaction to men as well. It's history, it just keeps coming back at us.
Yeah, it's a very fundamental psychological, like when your group status is threatened, you have a knee-jerk reaction, which is, there's certain things that are afforded to you just based on your identity. And when those things are started to call into question, or there's two different, and now this is really nerdy, but there's this interesting framework for thinking about kind of, it's actually couched in like white identity. So this idea of racial identity also affording privileges and things in Western societies. And it's the deny, dismantle, or sorry, now there's I'm getting confused because there's two different frameworks and they've evolved it, but it's deny, distance, or dismantle are the reactions that people can have when they're faced with kind of identity threatening issues. And so denying is basically saying like, that's not true. That's like not a real thing. And just like kind of burying your head in the sand. Distancing is saying like, that's true of my group broadly, but not for me because X reason, right? And that can be seen as like, I mean, like, yes, I'm white, but I'm also poor, right? And so it doesn't apply to me as like kind of white person. And then dismantle is the actually adaptive response, which is like, that is true. This is a structural issue. How do I as an individual work to change the structures that are creating these power structures so that we have more equity for everyone, right? And that's obviously a very difficult response to get people to have, because that's like, people have to have the psychological resources. They have to have a message framed in a certain way that's connecting with that. But so that's has been done and validated in the world of race. But the analog to gender is this idea of masculinity being threatened, and the same kind of responses can happen. I think it's a very fundamental idea, and there's two different responses that I think are really interesting, which is this idea of meritocratic threat, which is basically saying like the achievements that you've done in your life are partly just due to the status of your group rather than your individual work. And that can be threatening. You don't like to hear that. Then the other one is the more traditional group status threat, which is when your group status is called into question or there's a risk of your group losing status, that can be activating in a way where you want to maintain the status quo, which benefits you. And these are like, I think a lot of, for example, conservative media is really tapped into both of those responses. And like this idea of, things used to be better and now they're worse, and is getting at that group status threat. It really foments that. And that puts people into kind of the scarcity mindset of like, how do I maintain my group status? And it's really easy to then pit people against other groups when you're in that kind of scarcity mindset. And I think that's true of the masculinity influencers as well, where it's like you're scapegoating women or other, gender minorities as a way to kind of build unity among men, or like build kind of a base, I guess you could say. Anyway, sorry, we wanted to nerd out a little bit on the psych stuff, but happy to pivot back to the report. But again, I nerd out on this all day, so forgive me.
No, it's all relevant. No, it's all interesting and relevant, I think.
All right, Carlos. So now that we've finished the interview and maybe we've had a moment to think about it, do you have any big takeaways from the talk we had with Dr. Pete for this first part?
Sure. I mean, he is a font of information. I'm like endlessly impressed with that guy. Really, really sharp. And I don't know, just kind of running circles around my brain processing. But I know he didn't really focus on multiple masculinities in his report, but that was something that was a totally new concept for me. Yeah, I'm definitely going to drill down on that and have a closer look at what that means and I don't know, some more examples of that, because I found that to be pretty interesting. What about you?
Yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting as well. And it's something that, like, as we've been talking, I've been kind of struggling with, because like, what is masculinity? It's this weird thing. And there was kind of framing with that multiple masculinities, there's that talk we had at one point with him about confidence and ignorance, and like men not being able to admit they don't know something. And at the same time, like, I feel like it takes a lot more confidence and like true confidence to admit that you're ignorant. Sure. And that's kind of part of like a display of that multiple masculinity. Like this is what the Manosphere thinks it looks like. They think it looks like always having the answer and shutting down these conversations if you don't, or pretending that you do have the answers, versus like saying, I don't know this, and I'd like to learn about this, or I don't know about this, and I'm fine with not knowing.
Right.
In some cases. So like, yeah, I think that had a nice fit with that multiple masculinities thing. I thought that was really interesting. I also enjoyed listening to you talk about how you talk to men and women differently. And like, that was big takeaway for me.
Was
It's
it?
like, I think like, we know that we do that, right? But I don't know, just the idea of like, I code switching for a gender, not for like different scenarios necessarily.
Sure.
I mean, I guess it is a different scenario, but like, and I was thinking about what we're doing, and you were saying like I talk differently to men, and I was like, I don't feel like you do that here, but I guess this is kind of our man's group.
It is 100% our man's group. Yeah, man. I hadn't actually thought of it that way, but yeah, I wouldn't be having. Well, I have thought about it in the sense that some of the topics that we discuss and that we delve into, even like off mic, I don't know that we would organically have those conversations. You know, just you and I, and I'm fine with that. Like we're doing it, and we're actually, we're hitting all the points that we need to for healthy mental state, but like I don't know that we would do that organically without the show. You know what I mean? And I really hadn't thought of this as like a safe space for us.
A safe space where we're open to the entire public.
yeah, where everyone has access to our safe. Just like everyone puts their ear to the wall on our safe space and can listen to what we're saying.
No, and I think it's encouraging also, like, for anybody out there that feels like uncomfortable with this kind of vulnerability or sharing or talking to other men, like listening to Dr. Pete say, like, he got into this partially because he wasn't doing those things. And his fiance was like, how's your buddy doing that you just spent like hours with playing video games? And he's like, I don't know. Like, if somebody like Dr. Pete, who's like totally enmeshed in this, can have these deficits and learn to address them, then like, it's totally okay, or it's like totally normal for people not to have this in their life and go about learning how to do these things. It's not unexpected that somebody would have these deficits in the way they relate to other men. It's like a little sad that it's so normal that we don't have these things, but at the same time, it shouldn't make anybody feel bad about these deficits and then going out and addressing them and making them better, and knowing that you can have these connections and you can talk with other men.
Well, it's like anything else or everything else we've discussed previously, and in my little mind of positive psychology and even in the woo, you got to catch it. Once you catch a behavior, a thought, you can change it from there. But you have to be aware of it before you can make any kind of change. You know what I mean? And that's what happened with Pete. And his wife asked him, "How was your friend doing that you're just spending all this time interacting with?" And he's like, I don't know. He's good at his game.
Yeah. So yeah, fun conversation. I took a lot away from it, and I'm probably going to listen to it when it comes out a few more times, just because there was a lot in there that we got through real fast, and rich stuff.
We went through it quick, and we still got a second half to get through, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the second half. And and then future interviews, man. Like, I hope they all go as well as they have with Dr. Pete. He's kind of a self-starter, you know what I mean? He interviews himself, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, he knows so much that it's more like, what he's picking from this large bouquet of knowledge, and like, what am I going to present at this moment?
Right.
So he gives us something beautiful to smell.
And he's nimble too. You know what I mean? You ask him a question. I like listen with editing. I'm like, oh, that came out of left field when I was asking questions. But he's nimble enough to draw it right back to the topic at hand. He's an impressive guy.
Yeah. Well, he knows his stuff.
Yeah, he does.
Unlike us.
Unlike us.
Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for the second half of our interview with Dr. Peter Fisher from Movember Institute of Men's Health, where we'll be getting deeper into the real face of Men's Health report. Have a good one.